I'm Jack Ferguson, and I was Congressman Don Young's first chief of staff, and he was elected in a special election, March 14th, 1973. And when he came to Congress, he said, if I don't get the pipeline authorized, they won't reelect me. This is our number one priority. And in that period of time, from March 14th to August 3rd, was the consideration of the authorization of the pipeline in the House. And it passed the House August 3rd, 1973. It passed the Senate November 16th, 1973. So it was signed into law by the president, and Roger C.B. Morton then signed the right-of-way permit, and then they were allowed to build and construct the pipeline down the corridor that had been set aside. Now, as you know, the oil was discovered in 1969. And then what happened was Secretary of Interior Stuart Udall, the brother of Mo Udall, who ran for president, but Stuart Udall from Arizona, denied the right until the settlement claims, the native settlement claims, were resolved. And so the Congress went in, and December 16th, 1971, they passed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which they designed it after corporations, so there are 12 regional corporations which exist, and then village corporations. The regional corporations had subsurface rights, the village corporations had surface rights. The state received lands, federal lands, as did the native corporations. And that Settlement Act established a lot. It set up 7I, where all the resources developed through the 12 corporations were shared, 30% were shared. And it did a number of things along those lines. The Settlement Act itself has been amended many, many times to certain inequities that appeared and such. But once the Settlement Act was passed, then the right-of-way was granted. And so then they started construction on the pipeline. And so from January 28th of 1974, when the lease was signed, till yesterday, when the first barrel of oil traveled down to Valdez, 800 miles. All right, so given that sort of rough start, there's a number of things that happened, of course. We were told that Sohio, which was bought out by BP, was like months away from insolvency until this thing got resolved. I mean, so there were huge consequences. There was a lot of time that had gone by because of legal obstructions. Now, after the Settlement Act was cleared and the right-of-way was given, the environmentalists, Friends of the Earth, Wilderness Society, and others still fought the construction. And so they sued the Department of Interior for issuing what was called a SLURP, a Special Land Use Permit. Now, SLURPs were issued routinely. They came out of the day when the railroads were given rights away and all of the land adjacent to it. And the land made them wealthier than the railroad. They had townships and everything else built out of this. They owned it. They owned the land. Well, Congress wasn't going to do that with pipelines. So in the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920, they put in 120 feet right-of-way. And now, as you saw the pictures last night with gargantuan machines and everything else, you couldn't do all that in 120 feet. I mean, that was designed for a horse-drawn carrier to circle around, and had nothing to do with 48-inch cubic lines. It's very small pipelines. So we believed, or at least Alaska believed, we would take it to the Supreme Court because we had lost in court and such. And the Supreme Court, evaluates 2,000-3,000 cases a year, and they only grant maybe 20, And what you do is you permission by the writ of certiorari. So they denied the writ of certiorari in April 1973. And so it came to, and they said quite simply, amend the law. If you want more than 120 feet, go get more than 120 feet. So we went to Congress, and a bill was introduced by Congressman Young. And again, I was his man. I was the legislative aide as well as the chief of staff. And I kept a careful record. Every day I kept a log of what happened from then to when the ball passed, which was one of the smartest things I've ever done. I turned it into my master's thesis, 120 pages, and that's what I gave Jim Palmer last night. And I've given it to Parnell for the Stevens papers, and I gave it to Alaska Pipeline. So they have the signed copy of it. And I hadn't read it in 50 years, but when Congressman Young passed away, he had a copy in a safe, and they called me up and said, Jack, we have your thesis here. And I looked at it, and I said, I haven't seen this in 50 years. And I read it. God damn, this is good. So anyway, and I try to get these guys to read. Yeah, we'll get around it. We get around to it. But it's one of, it shows you not only the legislative process, but all the hoops we had to jump through. And one of the more interesting things was in the House bill, they had two titles. They amended the slurp to be larger than 120 feet. And then they also found the environmental impact statement had complied with NEPA. Now, Congress had never done that before. They just, compliance, Now, you could sue on that, but that's what they deemed. That was in the House. In the Senate, they only had one title, and that was to amend the 120 feet, but they didn't touch the NEPA compliance section. So we came to Congress, and we passed it in the House. And on August 3rd, 1973, as I mentioned. And after a long battle, and then it would go to the Senate. Now, if you might recall from your days of civic lessons, you go to conference. After it passes, you go to what's known as the conference report, both in the House and the Senate, and they meet, and they have to settle on a set of languages. They amend either side. They recede and concur, and that sort of thing. So what Stevens said was, look, we need the NEPA compliance section, but I doubt that I can win it in the Senate. So what we will do is when we get to conference, the chairman, Senator Scoop Jackson, will recede and concur. And so once that's done, then it's then put into the conference report. It returns to both bodies, the Senate and House, conference report, but it's not amendable. You just pass it, and then it's that text that goes to the White House to be signed. So Stevens did not want to challenge the NEPA compliance section, the Title II of the House bill, and so on. So Mike Gravel, who was up for re-election, wanted to bring it before the body of the Senate. Now, if the Senate declined and said no, the chairman of the conference report, Scoop Jackson again, was bound by the Senate vote. He couldn't recede and concur. He was bound by the body he represented. So you don't want to vote that. You just want to accept it in Congress, send it back, vote it that way. Gravel insisted, and Stevens was furious. They always were fighting anyway. But put Ted in a spot. Well, hell, he's gonna have to try to pass it in the Senate. Well, it came out 49-49, and Spiro Agnew, the vice president, the president of the Senate, cast the tie-breaking vote, and that's how we got the bill. But it wasn't really 49-49. Senator Brooke of Massachusetts, the first African-American senator, well known for opposing the pipeline, well known for opposing the NEPA compliance section, which the environmentalists were very concerned about because it would have been a precedent. And so he came to the Senate floor. Now, the second part of my career was working on the Senate floor for Ted Stevens. I was his chief of staff, and he hired me away from Don Young. So in the 70s, that was the basis of my education experience in the Senate. Now, when you go into the Senate floor to vote, you walk through a couple different doors, depending on where you are in the building, the Capitol, and so on, and you look for your guy, and he might come up to you and tell you what the vote's about. I had about 15 senators I had to cover. Well, here's what it does, and your colleague is going to vote for it. The leadership doesn't want it, and whatever. I'd give them a frame of reference as to how to vote. Well, Brooke came in a different door than he usually does. He didn't find his guy, and he looks down in the well of the Senate, and he holds his hand up, and the clerk in the Senate goes, "Mr. Brooke votes yay," and so on. And he turned and walked out. Now, oftentimes in the Senate, if you vote yay, you could be voting for it, or you could be voting against it, because they'll put the question in the negative. And so he didn't know what it was. So he was voting for it. The question had been actually put in the negative. So, he voted yay and to defeat the next voters. I think you follow me. I'm pretty sure that's how it worked. But it wasn't the way he wanted to have voted. He voted for the pipeline, and he thought he was voting against the pipeline. So he turns around, walks out, but he's the 49th vote. Otherwise, we would have lost it. He turns around, walks out, and disappears. And this is before we had internet, before we had cell phones, and all of this. And only a senator can vitiate his vote. And they can't, well, he didn't mean to do that. Nope. Only a senator has the right to vote and to vitiate a vote. So it stood, and that's how it passed. At that time, we're estimating the oil from Prudhoe Bay was, the pipeline was 1.1 million. And they assumed it was roughly 10% of the oil needs of our country. And, we had a lot of language in that bill, liability spills, you can't export it, all of these things that were modifying the bill to appease lobbyists or other objections from people that think, well, you're just going to export it. Why would you spoil all this land and we wouldn't be the beneficiaries? So we had, it was lifted years later, but still that was going on. I think the need for the oil was seen as such a big deal. Now remember, there was an oil embargo from Saudi Arabia, and people, could only buy gas if their license plates was started with an odd number, and then the next day, the guys with the even number would go, and the lines would be 2 blocks long, and sometimes you can get a full tank, and that drove it home. I mean, it was an inconvenience to every single household. So the idea of needing oil was really on everyone's mind, and actually, that came a little bit after we passed the bill, but people could see it happening. And then when it did happen, it sort of justified the whole thing. So we were on a roll. We were ready to go. And everyone was very supportive at the time. And, the price of that pipeline at that time was $8 billion, and 18,000 people worked on it. It was like nothing compared to what would be today, like $42 billion for a natural gas pipeline, essentially on the same route, or maybe a little shorter. Yeah, so now, it never crossed our mind that we were going to keep at it until we got it, and that was our best shot was, the Supreme Court saying, no, you got to do it. And then we found the actual question, whether or not Congress can deem a law has been complied with, could be considered a constitutional question. So we had Harry Goldberg, who had been retired from the Supreme Court, testify. And of course, he's not a member of the Supreme Court. His opinion is the opinion of a lawyer, but he had been a former Supreme Court jurist. And he said no, and so on. And we used that, but then Ted was very clever. We put in, you had to challenge the compliance section within 160 days or forever hold your peace. And so no one challenged it. But even the question, can you eliminate a challenge, could be a constitutional question. And so on. But no one challenged it after the bill passed and 160 days passed, and then, off we went. And, oftentimes people say today, well, you might be able to drop MPRA, but you'll just be sued until you lose your interest and so on. And I gave it to Alaska, and so they all have a signed copy. It's a document of historical interest. I had worked for a congressman 2 years prior. I had my master's program, which just was missing its thesis. I was working on a thesis from a different angle, actually, on the UN. And when I left, I had to go in the Army. So I went into the Army, served there, and then I went right to D.C. and was hired by a congressman, and right down the hall, and I walked right up that hall. It was 2010 Longworth Building. I walked right in there. The first day Don Young sat in his office, and I had researched what was going on, and there was an opposing pipeline overland through Canada that Congressman John Anderson of Illinois was promoting. And so we not only were fighting the environmentalists, we were fighting a vote on which routing to take. And so on. So I had broken leg. I crutched into Don Young's office, 1210, and sat down, and he looked around, and I told him what I knew about the pipeline, the denial to sit, what happened here, what happened there. And he says, okay, you're hired. And he says, why is your leg broken? I broke it skiing. He says, you're not a ski bum, are you? No, sir, I just broke it skiing. And he said, you a lawyer? I said, no, sir, I'm just have a master's degree. Good, sit down. I don't like lawyers. So he hires me, and I became his first chief of staff. But I said, it's 1973. I said, you're going to give me a raise. And he said, well, what are you making now? He says, $12,000 a year. He goes, really? And he says, all right, $12,000. I said, well, I was hoping to get a raise. And he goes, all right, $13,000 a year. So I went to work. Now, mind you, a congressman only made $43,000 during that time. And as an aide that worked for me liked to have said, Jack, you realize that $13,000 is now $70 in today's, so on. But anyhow, and Don and I became very, very close. And as you know, he served for a very long time. And I was telling Senator Murkowski, Lisa Murkowski, I said, your dad served Frank Murkowski for 23 years. And at the end of your term, this term that you're serving, 26 years, both of them together are 49 years. That's how long Don Young served, 49 years. And so when he went his way, he was the Dean of the House. He served as Dean of the House for maybe 3 years, the longest serving member of the body, other than John Dingell, who actually served longer overall. But he was, at that time, the longest serving member. 4 years, yeah, and then a couple of years for Stevens. But when you work for a member like that and you get as close as you are, I mean, you're his aide de camp. I mean, I was always at Stevens' side when he was on the floor and that sort of thing. And Don, I wasn't privileged to go to the floor in the House. The staff members aren't privileged in the House. They can go with the managing partner and sit on a bench, but they don't get to walk around the floor like I was privileged to do in the Senate. So I did that. And then as someone says, when you stop working for Ted, he said, I never did. I mean, it was always fun. I mean, I would go into a crowded room of lobbyists, maybe a fundraiser for the senator, and he'd go like this to me, and I'd run over, and he'd whisper in my ear, and I'd sort of slide away, and then all of the lobbyists would, surround me. What'd he say? What'd he say? And he said, well, he said on Tuesday he's going to bring up the defense supplemental, but he doesn't want any amendments. And so he told me to go to the leadership and said, be sure that I object to any amendment that may be placed at the desk on my, bill. And I went, oh, yeah, all right. What he really said was, go get my car. In D.C., you never really feel like you are a resident of D.C. You feel like you're working on behalf of your state in D.C. All right, well, my father was an insurance adjuster in Seattle, and he was head of this General Adjustment Bureau serves. In those days, insurance companies hired adjusters, sort of a part of the deal. Well, you adjust it, we'll pay it. So he came up here for the earthquake, and he did all the settlements on the earthquake in 1964. And then in 1968, he went up to Fairbanks for the flood. And he really fell in love with the thing, and he loved Wally Hickel. He liked Wally Hickel. That guy can make a decision and stick with it. Boy, he was pleased with him. And such. So then I see there was one element. Oh, yes, my grandfather went up for the gold rush, the Skagway gold rush, and he came back and said the only people making money up there are the people selling shovels. And so he came back to Seattle, started a furnace company. He must have been cold up there, so on. So that's I was raised in that manner, and then I went to work for Alaska myself. And my sister, I got her a job with Alaskan Airlines back when they used to handwrite the tickets. She worked for Alaskan Airlines for 43 years, and is honored as what they call a legend of the line. And then I married from Veronica from Ketchikan, who lived in Anchorage. And so I've been voting here since '73. Yeah, no, we've had a lot of clients. We do land exchanges, mineral extraction, rights of way. We've represented, railroads. We've represented shipping companies. We've represented airlines, NPRA, National Petroleum Reserve. It'd be called the Naval Petroleum Reserve. And so it was set aside for the Navy for some reason that they could go to for resource should they need it. And it was controlled by the Department of Defense. So we passed a bill that changed it from the Navy land to interior land. So it went from the Naval Petroleum Reserve to the National Petroleum Reserve. And then it's the Colville River goes up, and it separates NPRA from Dead Horse. But when the Naval Petroleum Reserve was created by executive order, and they just assumed that the river, the Colville River, flowed from the north to the south. You have the north, you have the south that flows. Well, the Colville River doesn't flow that way. It flows into the Arctic Ocean from the south to the north. And so they so inartfully wrote the executive order. They said the left bank or the right bank, and they had it all turned around. And what's important to that is, if it's the west bank, then the state owns all of it, and the subsurface of the Colville River, which is rich in oil. The Armstrong Oil Company is developing along the Colville, or when it was with the Navy, it was the east bank, and so the state didn't have claim to the Colville River. And what was funny about that was there was a very famous interior lawyer named Paul Curtin, and he spent all of this time arguing that the state had the right to this thing, and then when it changed hands, he had to argue the other way. And so he was a great guy. He was blind, but he knew the law. And anyway, that was probably one of the biggest feats that we've done. Obviously, the pipeline authorization is huge. We represented BP for a number of years on their concerns up on the North Slope. We were a big part of ANWR, the fight to open up ANWR. The state had given some monies to a lobby group that headed up by Roger Herrera, Tara Sweeney, and we were all in the townhouse that I owned. We all lobbied together. I was sort of the consultant lobbyist, and they were sort of the state lobbyists, and we fought for ANWR over that time. ANWR bill in the Senate was raised 13 times. And the one time when we really got it passed and sent to the president, it was vetoed. But it was part of a larger bill that was vetoed. So we never actually, until, in recent time, was able to open up ANWR. And by that time, over the many years, the environmentalists had fought and fought and fought. It sort of had a shelf life. And then oil shale came in, and other elements of oil and gas industry were changing. So ANWR was not as important as it once was. But everyone always thought that ANWR was where the play went. The Sadler Rochett Field, went that way east into the Arctic National Wildlife Range. So that fight went on for years. Oh, and then I also represented the natural gas pipeline, and I did that for a number of years under John McMillan. And in that instance, the natural gas pipeline was going to go overland, over through Canada, into Alberta, and then down into Chicago. And we passed a number of things that were almost historical, such as a completion guarantee permit. So if you have let's say your gas is, $8 a cubic foot or whatever, and down in Chicago or whatever, it's $5. Well, they would meld it, so there would be $6 there, and then we'd get that dollar, so we could, afford so it would be marketable. You can't do that anymore. It's like telling one other guy to pay for my gas and my customers. So it's competitive. So that didn't work. Now, still to this day, we're fighting on natural gas, whether we bring it down to Valdez, whether it's LNG at the top, but no longer do we have an overland route. I remember one of the votes, and it was very, very close. We thought we had a vote from Senator Smith from Oregon, and he turned on us, and so we didn't prevail in that vote. But Bob Byrd was the majority leader, and Ted Stevens did a lot for Byrd. And when it used to be used to be a protocol in the Senate that if both senators, regardless of parties, agreed on something that affected their state only or dramatically, that the rest of the Senate would support it. Well, Bob Byrd had this thing called the black lung disease from West Virginia. And if you didn't vote for black lung disease, he wouldn't vote for anything. And he had a little paper, and you go up to him and say, Senator, could you support me? He said, well, just a minute here. He'd pull out this laminated thing. He didn't support me in black lung. I guess that'd be no. So he would do that. Well, anyway, Stevens went up to him and says, I got to have your vote, right? So we thought we were going to get it. Because they've served side by side very long time on the Appropriations Committee together, and certainly honored the protocol. So he goes over, and they do this thing in the Senate. It's this bear hug where they grab you and they bring you right into their neck. Huey Long was famous at that. Sort of like, and then the grabber was the guy in control, right? So Byrd walks over to Stevens and grabs him and is whispering into his ear like this. And everyone's watching. And I could see from Stevens' response that he was saying no. But not everyone understood that. Now, Bob Byrd was a power in the Senate. And even though you were a colleague, a Democrat colleague, you didn't get to go up to him and say, how are you voting? You don't ask Bob Byrd how he's going to vote. So he goes back to his desk, and this beehive of Democrats go around. What'd you say? What'd you say? He had so many people. And then the clerk in the House said, Senator Byrd votes no, and that sort of thing. But we went through a couple of those episodes where we just got close but not good enough. And it was, again, a very strong environmental vote and that sort of thing. Yeah, no, in the paper, I tell a lot of legislative objections and how we got around them and everything else. I think that was, I'm 25, it was a pretty big deal for me. I was one of the youngest chiefs of staff on the Hill, both in the Senate and the House. So I was very privileged, and I had a great launch of my career as a lobbyist, of course. But, there are stories, when I heard about the pipeline floating, or they had to dig up 40 miles of pipeline because they hadn't x-rayed the well properly. You're an engineer, right? You're supposed to know that this pipeline is going to have ballast, if it's buried in the ground until you get oil in it, this thing. And that's what it did. It literally, it was in wet ground, and it just floated the damn pipeline, the empty pipeline, up to the surface. So they had to remedy this. So what they did is they built these huge cement sleeves, and they put it around the pipeline. So they literally anchored it below ground. Now, a lot of the pipeline's above ground, and a lot of it's below ground. And so that was the one that floated. Now, it was required somehow by regulation that each of these welds were to be x-rayed inside and out. So as the pipe got laid and welded together, there's a machine inside the pipeline that x-rayed it, and then there's a machine outside. And it had to work in tandem. It's a little bit difficult, and so on. Well, the contractor that had to x-ray the pipeline was way behind, and so he falsified the welds of about 40 miles. He used x-rays of pipes that he'd already used in the past, and he just said, here's the new x-rays. Yep. Well, there was a whistleblower who said, nope, those aren't the x-rays of those welds. Those are the x-rays of a weld already passed, right? So John Dingell was the chairman in the House of the Interstate Commerce Committee, had a jurisdiction over pipelines, said, you're going to dig it up. They had to dig up 40 miles and have them x-rayed, and then you can bury it again. Yeah.